If you're thinking that it's just a simple way for you to save money in tax, it's probably not a good idea to use your exemption because it can cause you a lot of hassle and frustration. If you sell your shares in a qualified small business corporation here in Canada, can you multiply the lifetime capital gains exemption with you, your spouse, and your children? And the answer to that is yes, you can, as long as you have the proper corporate structure. However, there are some nuances that you're going to want to be aware of if you start using your children's capital gains exemptions that I'm going to be talking about here in this video. All right. So, first of all, what is a lifetime capital gains exemption? Well, that is where you sell the shares of a qualified small business corporation. And there is a definition of what's considered a qualified small business corporation that you must line up with. You'll get the first $1,250,000 of share sale tax free. So that's worth about $300,000 in tax savings to you. So if you multiply that with your spouse and your two children, for example, that'll save you about $1.2 million in tax. So definitely sizable. Now, what is the proper structure that you want to have to multiply that exemption out? And that's where we like to see a discretionary family trust own the common shares of your operating company. So when you sell the shares of your operating company, the trust actually sells those shares. And then you would have your children and your spouse as discretionary beneficiaries of that trust. And as a trustee of that trust, you are then able to use your discretion and allocate out the capital gain from the share sale to whichever beneficiaries you choose. So if you decide that you want to use one of your kids' exemptions or both of your kids' exemptions, you can certainly do that up to the $1.25 million. Now, what's important to know, though, that a lot of people fail to understand is that if you use your child's exemption, you must make payable the taxable portion of that exemption. So if you use the exemption of $1.25 million, you must make payable to that child $625,000. Right? How are you going to make that payable? Well, typically what would happen is you would either pay it out in the form of cash to them, or most often you would use what's called a promissory note. So the trust would issue out a promissory note to that child saying that they promised to pay that child this amount. So when you sell the shares of your company, typically what would happen is you would probably retain some of that capital inside your trust, and that would be invested into market-based investments. And those investments are going to grow over time, and you're going to have distributions from those investments, whether it be capital gains, dividends, or interest income. Now, those distributions, as a trustee, you're going to want to distribute those out to the different beneficiaries, because if you don't, it's going to be taxed inside the trust at the top marginal rate, which is 48% at the end of the year. So you definitely don't want to leave those distributions inside the trust. You would simply, as a trustee, you would allocate that out to the different beneficiaries. So oftentimes what happens is parents will allocate that out to their minor children because their minor children aren't working. They have a low marginal tax rate. And this is a way that you can definitely achieve tax savings by doing that. However, the nuance there is that as you start to allocate this out, you must either pay it to them in the form of cash, or you must increase the promissory note that's payable to them, right? And so suddenly the promissory note keeps climbing. Well, how do you pay off this promissory note? Well, what you would do is you would track expenses associated with that child. So let's say that they go to private school, for example, and that's $50,000. Well, you would pay that for them. And then what would happen? So, for example, the trust would take out $50,000 on the child's promissory note as repayment of it. And then you would use that to fund the private school tuition. And now the promissory note goes from $625 down to $575. But then you have a distribution from the trust in the year from the income allocations. And now let's just say that that's $20,000. So suddenly now you went from $575 back up to $595. So there's definitely tax savings to be achieved. But what you have to be aware of is that there's a tracking nightmare there as well. You've got to keep all your expenses. You've got to keep those receipts in case CRA ever wants to audit you and look at them. But then you must do trustee resolutions at the end of each year to allocate the income, update the promissory notes at the end of each year as well. So there is definitely tracking that needs to be done, and you can't ignore that. My advice on that is I would only ever use my child's exemption to the extent that you actually want to pay this money out to them. Because I see far too often where parents will use the exemption without really the idea of wanting to pay this money to them. So if you are the type where you really do want to help your kids out with private school, you want to help them get ahead in life with their investments or perhaps buy a home, then using their exemption, allocating it out either through cash or through a promissory note, and then paying it to them when they're about to buy a house is actually not a bad strategy. So I just wanted to make you aware that just using your kids' exemptions willy-nilly is not worthwhile. You definitely want to look into the different nuances, make sure that you fully understand it, because I find that too often people promote the idea of using the exemptions without really truly understanding What does that mean? What are the implications? What's the pros, but also what are the cons of doing that? You need to understand both of the pros and the cons.